Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome. And if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we explore and theory craft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Today, we are doing another one of our quick builds, where we'll be exploring a summarized character build for D&D 5e. As always with quick builds, let me know in the comments below if there's ever any character builds you'd like to see me explore in the future. The concept for our build today comes from DnDUnoptimized. They asked if we would be able to create a character that only uses, or at least incorporates, light into their attacks. They could be descended from a god of light or an angel, perhaps some other celestial being as well. But the idea is that we actually have a full challenging restriction of trying to get light incorporated into each one of our attacks. I just wanted to share a quick recommendation for any of you who like the control aspect of D&D in combat, or like to look at the numbers of how things can break down when you're doing a character build. The DnDUnoptimized has put out some really great videos on the subject, and I would highly recommend checking them out. Back to our build though, this is quite an interesting challenge, as it poses two restrictions. Number one, we want to incorporate light into all of our attacks. And number two, we want to attack. We don't want to necessarily use saving throws, or at least I'm not going to try to use saving throws. I'm going to try and take it upon myself to make the character be able to actually attack and have light added in some way, shape, or form. For the sake of this build, I'm going to count our light getting added to our attacks as radiant damage specifically, since that seems to make the most sense. I'm going to say that we're trying to get as much radiant damage as possible onto each one of our attacks, and that we're actually attacking, not just using cantrips that deal radiant damage, in order to give us our champion of light. To start the build off now, I just want to say that I actually recorded this video already, and when I was going through to edit it, I realized that there were a number of issues wrong with that build that I had kind of overlooked that made it more or less impossible rules as written. The main issues come at around levels 1 and 2. Once I get into the actual level breakdown of the build, I'll explain why those levels are so difficult. But for now, the reason I'm talking about this is because our lineage is Aasimar. We want Aasimar because it's thematic for being a child of a celestial being, or angel, or deity. We also want it for our third level ability that allows us to add radiant damage. Whether you are a Scourge Aasimar or a Protector Aasimar, being able to turn on a feature for a full minute that lets us add radiant damage to our attacks or spells is just what we want for this build in particular, who's trying to get as much radiant damage as possible onto their attacks. The reason I got this wrong before is because I had thought that that was a feature that every Aasimar gets right away at level 1, and that kind of helped the build out a little bit. So that means until we get to level 3, we're not going to be able to add that radiant damage to any of our attacks. For our stats, we're going to want the following stats after point buy, and I'll explain why later in the build, but for right now, this is what we're going to want to end up with. We want 8 strength, 16 dexterity, 14 constitution, 14 intelligence, 14 wisdom, and 9 charisma. As an Aasimar, we have a +2 and a +1 that we can reassign to any stats that we want, thanks to the optional rules from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. And so we would have put the +2 into our dexterity and the +1 into any one of our constitution, intelligence, or wisdom. For the background of our build, any kind of background will really work for this character. Again, in the original video I had recorded, I had said that we wanted to take the Magic Adept feat as a free feat, and the only real way to do that would to have been to take the Astral Drifter background that came from the Spelljammer setting. That actually has to get reworked too, because the stuff we wanted from Magic Adept, we can't actually get. I'll get into why once we get to the level breakdown, but for right now, just know that any background actually works. Though if you wanted a free feat, then Astral Drifter fits thematically very well, or any other background that gives you a free feat could also work too. Starting at level 1 into our actual character build now, it's time to talk about what went wrong in the last video, and why I had to reorganize it for this one. Well, to start off with, at level 1, we're going War Cleric. Now, right away, we're going to ignore the heavy armor capability because that's not something we want on the build. The only reason we are going War Cleric is because we want the Divine Favor spell, and we want it right away at level 1 because Divine Favor is one of the easiest and best ways to get radiant damage applied to all of our attacks. As a full War Cleric, we'll have 2 spell slots to be able to cast Divine Favor twice per day. Hopefully that's all the encounters that we'll actually have in combat. And we can use a finesse weapon and get extra attacks out of it thanks to the War Priest feature that the War Cleric has access to. The reason this sort of went wrong before is because I had completely thought that Divine Favor was an actual cleric spell because I'm so used to seeing it on the War Cleric spell list. It's just sort of become hand in hand, but that's not true. Divine Favor is actually a Paladin exclusive spell that is on the War Cleric expanded spell list, and because of that, it makes it much harder for us to pick up. And since we want to have some source of radiant damage to add on to our attacks at level 1 right away, that means we can't go Paladin and wait to pick it up at level 2. Obviously, if you're starting at a higher level or just not really doing the challenge, then you could, but for the sake of this theory crafting build, we have to pick up War Cleric at level 1 in order to get Divine Favor. For the next 3 levels of the build, though, we're going with what the actual build is supposed to be, which, oddly enough, is Monk. Monk, level 1 to 3, for our level 2 to 4, is going to give us a lot of unarmed defense, unarmed strike, unarmed movement, key points, as well as the bonus action martial arts feature to be able to attack with an unarmed strike as a bonus action after we attack with either an unarmed strike from ourselves or from a monk weapon. If you picked up a short sword, for example, from being a war cleric, we could then attack with that and attack with the short sword again thanks to our War Priest feature, and once we run out of War Priest features, we can continue to attack as a bonus action with our unarmed strike. And the great thing about Divine Favor is that it says it applies to all weapon attack rolls that we make, which unarmed strikes count as weapon attack rolls even though they don't technically count as a weapon specifically. Because of that, they still work with Divine Favor, meaning that all of our actual punches and kicks from unarmed strikes are just doubled in damage from 1d4 to 2d4, and we deal radiant damage with them, which is amazing for us. At level 3 we get to pick a subclass, and here we're going with a subclass that is a little less powerful because it fits our theme perfectly, and it'll finally allow us to not have to worry about attacking with light ever again. We are going with the Sun Soul Monk. The Sun Soul Monk has access to the Radiant Sun Bolt feature that allows us to have a little ranged attack. It's not a weapon attack, so it's only a spell attack, meaning that things like Sharpshooter or other features aren't going to actually improve it. And even Spell Sniper doesn't improve it because we're not casting a spell or cantrip, we're just making a spell attack with this bolt of radiant energy. But that's all that we really care about, is the fact that we now have an on-demand attack to deal radiant damage. And the fact that it's ranged is actually pretty nice because it makes us a skirmisher. That means we can get up close and personal and mix it up in melee combat with our short sword and War Priest feature, and then eventually our unarmed strikes martial arts feature as well. Or we can blast an enemy at range if we really don't want to get close to them, still doing radiant damage. After we pick up this subclass at our total level of 4, we're going to make a complete other pivot in our build and go with a different class that really does not synergize with either of these two. We are a bit of an absurd character, but it's all in the name of getting as much light as possible to attack with. We're going Wizard. We're going to stick with Wizard all the way up till our level 9, which means that we'll be a Wizard 5, Monk 3, and then War Cleric 1. So we're going to be really behind on scaling for our ability score improvements, as well as extra attack. Luckily, because we have the War Priest feature and the martial arts bonus action, those two should hopefully let us sort of keep up with the other characters who do have extra attack, as we can still dish out a fair amount of damage. So the reason I'm going Wizard, and specifically once we get to level 6, aka Wizard 2, we're going to go Scribe Wizard, is because this is how we get our main radiant damage weapon. Besides, of course, the Radiant Sunbolt from Sun Soul Monk. It's going to take us a while to pick this up, but basically, at 3rd level Wizard / level 7 total, we're picking up Shadowblade. Then, we're not even going to use it because Shadowblade does not deal radiant damage, and we can't stack it with Divine Favor to let it deal radiant damage. Although we could let it stack with our Aasimar feature that we got at our total level 3, so you could use Shadowblade if you wanted to, but I think waiting 2 more levels, if you can, to get to Wizard 5, aka total level 9, will allow us to do even more with Shadowblade. Because we're a Scribe Wizard, we gain the Awakened Spellbook feature. That feature says that when we cast a spell that deals a certain type of damage, we can replace its damage type with another spell of an equal level to the level that we cast. So if we cast Shadowblade at level 3, and then we also use Spirit Shroud, which has access to radiant damage, we can make a Blade of Light, or maybe Saber of Light, since we are a little bit more dex based. And with this weapon now dealing radiant damage, we have a very powerful actual weapon that we can use. Shadow Blade, the spell, still counts as a simple weapon for all intents and purposes while we have it casted. It uses our dexterity, so we're still going to want to high dexterity when we eventually get our ability score increases. But because it counts as a simple weapon, that means it also counts as a monk weapon. Meaning that not only when we cast Shadow Blade and go to attack with it, can we use a bonus action to use our War Priest feature to attack with it again. Once we run out of War Priest features, we can also still use our Martial Arts feature to do a bonus action unarmed strike. This lets us get a lot of damage output with our Shadow Blade that is also pure radiant and completely on theme for us. It's a little odd that we're both a cleric, a monk, and a wizard, but I would think that our character is a scribe of the celestial beings or deities that we are descended from. Knowledge of magical texts, both arcane and divine, and we have also practiced and honed our own skills to be able to harness the power of the light inside us and use that light to attack. We have an on-demand ranged attack, we have a relatively on-demand melee attack with Shadow Blade, now turned into radiant damage, and that's a powerful weapon for us. We have Divine Favor that we can cast a couple times a day as well if we don't want to use Shadow Blade or don't have any 3rd level spell slots remaining. And we just have other various spellcaster features like cleric spells and cantrips and wizard spells and cantrips. So after picking up all those classes from levels 1 to 9, we now can just do whatever we want with the rest of the build. Levels 10 and 11, I do highly recommend going back to Monk to pick up our first ability score improvement / feat, as well as extra attack and stunning strike eventually, because extra attack is awesome, and stunning strike can work with monk weapons, which includes Shadow Blade, making it even more powerful of a feature for us. But after that, at level 12, you can pick anything you want. It is unfortunate that it took this long for the build to really get going, and we're still kind of behind in terms of our scaling. But for what it's worth, we pretty much have completed the challenge, assuming we have been able to have radiant damage available to us for each combat that we got into. In terms of recommendations, you could obviously pick and choose whatever sort of level breakdown you wanted to continue with, whether that's more monk, more cleric, or more wizard. Depending on which route you go, I would suggest making your stats align with that spellcasting class a little bit more, but obviously keep dexterity as your priority. And one last recommendation is the fact that if we were to start at a higher level, say level 10 or 11, and we knew that we were going to have access to radiant damage right away from something like Shadow Blade, but instead of Sun Soul Monk, we could actually go Kensei Monk. And the reason for this is because eventually, it still takes a while, but eventually at Monk 11, Kensei Monks get the ability Sharpen the Blade. And what Sharpen the Blade does is it allows us to pick a monk weapon that we're holding, well, Kensei weapon, but Kensei weapons can be monk weapons, meaning a Shadow Blade could be a Kensei weapon. And we can just imbue that Kensei weapon with the power of our own ki. And we can give it a bonus to attack and damage rolls of up to +3. You spend a number of ki points, 1 to 3, and the weapon gains that bonus. That means that this is the only actual way to give Shadow Blade a bonus to attack and damage rolls, effectively making it the equivalent of some very powerful actual magic weapons. It's a lot of work to pull off, but honestly it feels kind of neat and thematic, almost like we are accessing more and more divine power from our ancestors or those that we are learning from in order to summon a stronger divine weapon into our hands. Besides that recommendation though, feel free to take any levels into any class that you want. You could even go more absurd and pick up more sources of light from other various classes. Or you could just continue with one of your favorites from the 3 that we have. So, time to summarize the build. Well, it's been a little bit of a hectic build, especially since I had to completely rework and re-record it, given that Divine Favor did not work with Magic Adept the way I had hoped it would, and also that since the Aasimars don't gain their features that let them add radiant damage until level 3. That really made it difficult to find a source of radiant damage that can get added onto your attacks when you are levels 1 and 2. Technically, if you wanted to do this without actually sticking to just attacks, You could go straight cleric, especially light cleric, because that kind of makes sense. Pick up cantrips like Sacred Flame or Divine Word in order to have some on-demand radiant damage. You could also go paladin route and still pick up those cantrips and then just specialize into being a cantrip-based paladin that focuses on charisma instead of strength or dexterity like most paladins do. It might be a little anti-synergist because of the Divine Smite, but it would still work. But overall, I think I like the sort of weirdness in the theme of our character. We're a monk, cleric, wizard, some sort of student of celestial and ancient ways that has learned how to harness not only this divine power that they have learned about, but that also is probably inside them as well, given that we're supposed to be descended from these celestial beings. Other than that, let me know what you would change or add to get closer to the idea of this champion of light type character, or if there are any other ways to get around those restrictions of light on our attacks that I may have overlooked that could really help with levels 1 and 2. Because honestly, the main go-to I could think of was Divine Favor. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.